Hello and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I'm Ramjee Chandran with episode 116 of season 3, and this is part 2 of the two-part series on the fall of Bangalore. If you haven't listened to part 1, the episode immediately before this, I would encourage you to do that first because these two episodes were released together and this one you're about to hear picks up where the last one ended. In the last episode, Cornwallis had tightened his grip on the Bangalore fort through 12 days of systematic bombardment. The man in the fort, Bahadur Khan, the Mysore army, hit back with sallies and rockets, destroyed 2 British cannons, and on top of it, Bahadur Khan had planned an attack on the British cavalry camp. But Cornwallis, because he knew about this, had moved his cavalry out of the line of fire. And Bahadur Khan's gunners would wind up attacking empty tents. But how did Cornwallis know about the imminent attack? Because he was receiving intelligence from someone in Tipu's camp. Who fed Cornwallis this intelligence and at what cost? Join me as I follow the siege to the 20th of March, and then on the night of the 21st, we go over the wall. But before we climb walls, first, my thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support. They make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Dawn, the 17th of March 1791. From the ramparts of the Bangalore fort, Bahadur Khan's gunners looked out at the British camp, and they saw exactly what they expected to see. The cavalry lines, tents standing, apparently undisturbed since the previous evening. And then they opened fire. It was a coordinated salvo on that exact spot aimed at what their commanders believed was the single most valuable target in the British camp, Cornwallis's cavalry. The shells tore through the tents. Canvas lay in shreds. The ground churned up. Smoke was rolling across the lines. And from the ramparts it would have looked like a triumph. Except that there was nothing inside the tents because the cavalry had moved. The British infantry that had been sent to the approximate location where the cavalry had been did take some casualties. So even if this was a good trick by Cornwallis, it was not a trick that produced 0 losses. But compared to what would have happened had several thousand cavalry horses been standing, picketed, exactly where the Mysore gunners had aimed, the loss of those horses would have crippled Cornwallis's mobility for the rest of the campaign. It would have ended it. Instead, what should have been a devastating blow to the British became, in the British accounts that followed, a demonstration of Cornwallis's tactical foresight. A near disaster quietly converted into evidence of the commander's brilliance. But here's the more interesting question. How did Cornwallis know to move the cavalry that night? What was the intelligence that prompted this exact, perfectly timed deception? Well, the answer takes us away from the battlefield and to something closer to the world of espionage and bribery. Cornwallis, by this stage, had developed a deep frustration with the civil administration of the Madras presidency. To him, they were indecisive, slow, and not to be relied upon for anything that required speed or discretion. So for intelligence, he turned to 2 men, Captain William Reed and a young officer named Thomas Munro. You'll hear Munro's name again in this podcast. Indeed, right through history, he becomes one of the most consequential British administrators in the history of South India. But here in March 1791, he was a junior officer with a gift for languages. He had studied Persian deeply enough to have formed genuine opinions on the differences between Persian prose and Persian poetry. And here's an interesting aside. It was during the same intelligence effort that Munro came across and translated from the Persian a story about a merchant, a loan, and a pound of flesh. It was a story that had found its way 2 centuries earlier into Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. The citation about this appears later in Edmund Malone's Shakespeare Variorum of 1793, where he noted that the Persian manuscript had been in the possession of Ensign Thomas Munro at Tanjavur. Well, that was a small detour, but irresistible. Captain William Reed oversaw a network of Hirkaras. Now, these were intelligence runners who had infiltrated the enemy lines. Crucially, there was evidence of something far more significant sources operating from directly within Bahadur Khan's own camp. These were spies planted inside. High-ranking members of Bahadur Khan's staff, reportedly disillusioned by Tipu's increasingly paranoid demands, they were feeding precise details about the positions of the Mysore's heavy batteries and their intended targets for the next day. That was the cavalry camp. The spies inside were the men who had read the situation clearly. They were men who decided that their future lay with the British administration rather than with an Indian sultan whose grip on loyalty was tightening into something that looked more like fear. Their reports allowed Reed to construct a real-time map of the fort's artillery capabilities, and this was the thing that gave Cornwallis a decisive advantage even before a single shot was fired on the morning of the 17th of March, 1791. Some people have suggested, and it's worth saying plainly because it complicates the hero version of this story, that intelligence in this context may be just bribery and manipulation. William Reed and Thomas Munro were not simply listening at keyholes. They were by several accounts actively managing informants, paying for information and possibly for outcomes. As for historical evidence, we do not have a smoking gun that proves a specific bribe produced this piece of intelligence. But the broader pattern, that's British officers who were cultivating paid informants inside the Mysore lines, was very much part of how this battle was fought. So, was the salvo of the 17th of March a triumph of British military genius? Or was it the product of someone somewhere being paid to make sure that Cornwallis knew exactly what Bahadur Khan's gunners were planning to do at dawn? Maybe it was a combination of both, because that's how most wars work. The genius and the bribe aren't mutually exclusive. Often the genius is knowing whom to bribe and when. Either way, the effect was the same. Bahadur Khan's gunners had fired their best shot at what they believed was their best target. It had landed on empty canvas, and from this moment, the initiative of this battle belonged entirely to the British. The siege ground on. On the 18th of March 1791, Sapper's officers judged that a breach was actually now within reach, importantly, that it was practicable. During the night, another parallel, which is what sappers call ditches, was completed within 200 yards of the fort. The enemy firing incessantly through the work. The sappers placed guns in the newly constructed battery. On the 19th of March, a 4-gun battery of the British forces opened fire alongside the existing batteries in a steady cannonade against the breach and against the neighboring towers. The Mysore army's artillery was now beginning to slacken, even though all the musket fires from the ramparts remained pretty heavy. And on the 20th of March, the British widened the breach further. After this commercial break, I take you to the morning of the 21st. This was Tipu's last attempt to disrupt the siege, and what happened at 11 o'clock that night when a group called the Forlorn Hope went over the wall. And that is coming up right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Here we are on the morning of the 20th. We're standing next to a small bastion near the Delhi gate and a larger one flanking the shattered eastern curtain. At dusk, a working group from the 72nd Regiment was ordered to open a sap from the advanced battery to the crest of the glacis. Now, these describe the outermost slope of the fort's defenses. The work that they had to do lay so close to the walls that it could not go unnoticed. Sure, it didn't. A heavy fire fell upon that working party the moment they began their work. It did not end until they had reached cover. The casualties that night in the 72nd were considerable. And then on the evening of the 20th, Tipu made what we might call a Hail Mary move. He sent 700 elite horsemen into the fort, and these were cavalry. They were dismounting to fight his infantry, reinforcing Bahadur Khan's garrison on the eve of what everyone now understood was inevitable, and it was coming. These men, together with the garrison, stayed awake right through the night into the day of the 21st, maintaining constant fire, certain that the assault was going to come at any moment. It didn't come that day. On the morning of the 21st, Tipu, who was camped at Jigni, which is about 20 kilometers away from the Pete, mobilized his entire remaining force in that final effort to disrupt the siege. Army detachments moved towards high ground near the fort. They were intending to open a battery that would enfilade the Pete. Others dragged artillery to the banks of a nearby tank. A dense morning fog came down, shielding these movements until around 8 o'clock. And then when the mist lifted, the British responded. Drums to arms, columns advancing towards the Mysore lines, and Tipu's maneuvers were checked. By evening, the engineers had declared that the breach was now afoot and it was going to happen. The day's bombardment was concentrated on the towers and towards the guns that were overlooking the point of attack that had been picked for the breach. Throughout the day, Colonel Giles maintained heavy fire, intensifying the bombardment of the breach for a full hour before the assault. And as the time drew close, he continued to use blank cartridges, the noise and the smoke keeping the Mysore army defenders away from the walls because they couldn't really tell, allowing the assault party to move closer into position without being seen. 11 o'clock at night was the appointed hour. Known only to a small group around Cornwallis, the operation was so secretive that orders were passed through the lines in whispers. Roderick Mackenzie described the mood in words that any soldier would recognize. "The men of the Forlorn Hope," he wrote, after bestowing in reflection a soldierly and affectionate tribute on their fair friends, bid adieu to all worldly concerns, and riveted their minds to death or victory. To remind you, the Forlorn Hope was the group that would make it over the walls. It consisted of a sergeant and 12 men, 2 lieutenants, and 30 elite soldiers, and the name was exactly what it suggested. First into the breach, first to draw the enemy fire. Behind them came 14 companies of grenadiers and light infantry from 7 different regiments. Behind them, the main body of the British Army, the 36th, the 72nd, and the 76th, advancing in order of seniority. On the flanks, 2 Bengal battalions in the last parallel were ready to fan out. Integrated throughout, the Madras sappers carrying scaling ladders for section of the walls where the breach was incomplete. At the stroke of 11, a signal rippled silently through the ranks, and the advance began. The only path to the breach was a narrow causeway over 100 yards long, and the defenders, that's the Mysore army, had cut a trench across it, leaving a wall 2 feet wide on one side. 2 feet. Soldiers crossing in a single file in the dark with the fort was about to wake above them. And then it did wake. Blue lights and fireballs from the ramparts, illuminating the fort with a brilliance described as rivaling the noon sun. Musketry, rockets, the roar of cannon from every corner of the fort. The Forlorn Hope fought their way up the breach. The companies behind them fanned along the ramparts. Desperate single combat across the works. The courage, every account agrees about this, was equal on both sides, British and Mysore. And within an hour, the Bengaluru fort had fallen. Bahadur Khan's garrison had held for 14 days. They had destroyed British cannons. They had repulsed every sally. But Tipu's reinforcements had kept them awake all the previous night, expecting a storm that never came. And by the time it came on the 21st, Bahadur Khan's men were beyond exhaustion, unable in the end even to keep watch. The garrison that had held an army at bay finally succumbed not to superior firepower, but to the brutal arithmetic of fatigue. In the chaos that followed the breach, the terrified Mysore garrison fled through the narrow gateway into a crowd of women and children. The British troops could not distinguish between combatants and civilians, and by the end of the night, over 1,400 people lay dead. As for Bahadur Khan himself, Mackenzie's tribute had not been bettered in 2 centuries. He wrote, "Wherever gallantry is recorded, Bahadur Khan Killedar of Bangalore will hold a conspicuous place amongst the heroes of our times. True to his trust, he resigned it with his life, after receiving almost as many wounds as were inflicted on Caesar in the capital. In death, his manly countenance wore a mild yet commanding aspect. He possessed the genuine spirit of the soldier." Coming from a British officer, this was high praise. After everything was done and the surrender had happened, the British offered Bahadur Khan's remains to Tipu Sultan. Tipu replied that there was no more fitting place for Bahadur Khan's burial than the ground that he had died defending. The British arranged a funeral with full military honors for Bahadur Khan, and it was attended by senior Muslim officers from within their own ranks. Tipu Sultan, it is said, wept openly. What matters here at the end of this night is the strongest fort on the subcontinent had fallen, not through overwhelming numbers, not through some catastrophic failure of nerve, but through engineering, intelligence, logistics, and the slow grinding application of a military professionalism that no Indian power had yet faced quite in this form. Tipu had built Bangalore into an impregnable city, and it had fallen. But what is most important to understand is that the fall of Bangalore in 1791 was the very moment when British India became a reality. In the next episode, the terms of Tipu's surrender, and I will follow Cornwallis out of Bangalore onto the road to Seringapatam or Srirangapatna, and then we begin to understand what the fall of the Bengaluru fort meant for everything that came after it. And that episode is coming up soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.